Through the coronavirus epidemic, there's been lots of change in the world, especially with young people. A lot of young people are struggling, not just emotionally, but also with direction in their life. Sometimes they get caught up in the wrong crowd, which may cause them to feel stuck. Right. Hi, welcome to the Secret Men's Business Podcast. This is Joey Buzzattle, and on today's show, we're going to be speaking to someone that works with youth, and he's going to talk to us about how he helps to transform their lives and get them to see a direction that is way more positive. Today's guest is Mike Pringle. Mike, how are you?
I'm very well, Joey. So pumped to be here, brother.
I'm so excited to have you. You're very Your energy is fantastic.
Well, like I said, when it's topics that interest me, I'm super engaged. But yeah, if this was a podcast about geography, I'm going
We're
to
in
be silent.
trouble. So before we start, do you want to just tell people a little bit about what you were telling me before we actually started recording this? Tell them about yourself.
Well, it's one of those things. It's a hard thing sometimes when people say, "Tell me about you." Like, do you pull out a CV and sort of sit there and say, "Well, in 2017, I worked here and here." But I mean, essentially, I guess I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I'm a teacher. I work teaching mindfulness and mindful self compassion. I work in a youth custodial facility, aka a youth prison. Um, and much like the guy, the dude in the Big Lebowski, in many ways, I'm just trying to be the dude who abides, man.
Mm. How did you actually how did you end up coming across that job or that role? Like, did you work in the prison system beforehand and then went into youth, or was it something that you just tapped into?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I started off years ago in a I'm a martial artist and was a martial artist for a long time, and I was involved with a martial arts school that was very oriented towards access for all. So very oriented towards, in my particular case, when you're starting to be a martial arts instructor, you teach kids first, and there was a real heavy emphasis on kids with learning, basically that umbrella of children that have additional requirements. And I started that from a very young age, so it just felt really normal to me. So as I sort of progressed, I moved into the sort of fitness industry. I noticed that that wasn't something that was really transferable.
Right.
That there were people missing out or being othered. Um, so I guess that made me sort of think. It might have been my first paradigm shift in a career to go. I want to sort of point myself maybe more towards that. Ended up working for an organisation called the YMCA and was sort of pretty happy to sort of work on specific projects about, for example, people with disability accessing health and wellness programs. And as part of that, I started to work with disadvantaged communities and also sort of trying to put a frame on saying, well, okay, as an organization, could we help someone fund their membership? What could we do? So I started moving into more community outreach and then kind of got sort of into advocacy, I suppose, is the role, man. Um, and that sort of led me to say, okay, well, I'm toddling around the boundary line. I'd actually like to look at this whole scenario from a different lens, and I had the opportunity to work, to enter into a job where I was then sort of working for a school that operates within a youth custodial facility. So
Ah.
yeah, it's been a really interesting journey. And it's funny, it's not until you get a bit older that you look back and go, "Oh, I wasn't just Tetris. There was kind of a bit of."
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like I've been interviewing a lot of people on this podcast, which is a blessing, and I've met all these varieties of lives and all that. And I'm getting that same theme, and that is that you have an inbuilt people that do the sort of work that you do have an inbuilt part of them that wants to help. Do you know what I mean? I interviewed another prison, a prison. Oh, there's a word I've got to use. I can't use the word God, I have to use another word. Prison, something.
We would just call them workers, yeah, or that sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, he worked in a prison, an adult prison, and it was the same
Yes.
thing. You could see this inbuilt journey that he went on. So, do you sort of feel like totally at home at the fact that you're now in this job? Like, all the things that you went through sort of led you to this point?
Yeah, absolutely, brother. Like it resonates with me what you were saying, and I saw that episode by the way. That was rad. He seemed like a really cool chap. I think you've got an emotional compass, or you feel a calling, and I don't want to sound like too much like I've just read Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, which is I do like that book, but yeah, you've just got a truth or some way that you want to sort of point yourself towards, and I feel like I've been lucky enough that life has kind of gone, nah, dude, that's not where you are meant to be, or that's actually not what you want to be.
Mm,
Um, and that has been wrapped up in, what we could categorize as failure, and that sort of stuff. But yeah, there's definitely an interest in pointing to something that for me had more, I guess, more meaning might be the
yeah,
word.
yeah. I mean, like, because we're talking about the young population, and this is a men's only or a men's directive podcast, but we really do talk about everyone. So, but
Mm.
why? What do you think are the main things that the youth of Australia or the world are facing at the moment? Like, what are some of the struggles that we may not notice? Like, I think there's a lot of obvious ones, like dealing with COVID and dealing with climate change and things like that. But what do you hear as some of the main things that are causing our youth to become detained?
It's a tricky one because I think um, the youth might be similar in many ways to what all of us are going through in some ways, in that these days kids are being pointed more in a direction to define themselves potentially by what they produce or consume, which is really tricky. So, a lot of what I'm seeing anyway is we teach kids stuff, but I'm not exactly sure if we're teaching them skills.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Like, I feel that that's the biggest thing is that they're not like the clients that I see in my practice don't have any skills. They don't know how to
Yes,
handle crisis.
yes, and I think a lot of those processes, those rites of passage, that we live in a society now that I think lacks ritual. It lacks a lot of the structures that used to be have been removed. And on a bad day, I go, well, that's because we're swinging hard towards a pointy capitalist neoliberalist agenda. Um,
Hmm.
but we'll stay away from that. But it's more that I at the point, at the risk of being reductive, it would be to me that I don't think we teach stuff and things, but I don't necessarily think we teach skill sets. And I think probably pointing this discussion more at incarcerated youth, as I like to call them, my incarcerated learners. Um, we're looking at I'm every discussion I'm having with people, I'm trying to move people away from that concept that crime is a choice,
Mm.
particularly with these young kids. So um,
But before you go on, can I just quickly ask: are you noticing there's more males, or is it equal?
that's a really interesting one. I mean, Joey, I specifically work with males.
Okay.
Um, however, we have a school that sort of also works with kids that have been removed from community, because they're facing risk, not because of criminality, and we have a lot of girls represented in that population. Um, it's tricky. It's tricky with these young men. It's tricky with these boys. I mean, if you can cast your mind back to a time, in your youth when you were that age, I can, I was fortunate enough to bump into some fairly balanced mentors.
Yeah.
Um,
And there didn't seem to be. I mean, in my youth, I didn't seem to know except maybe one person, and it was also a gossipy thing that was actually in trouble with the law. Like, You know what I mean? Like, so the
Yeah.
environment was quite safe. Well, now I'm guessing that there's more of them, and there's more misconception. So when you were saying before about that you try to steer people away from the terminology, what do you think the community or the public are seeing rather than feeling?
With many things, Joey, it's about where you get your information from, isn't it? So, if you're kind of just reading the Herald Sun and watching Channel 7, then you're getting in my opinion, you're getting an edited version of the story. I I think I would love it if we could move as a society and a culture, or Jesus, lack of culture, to a point where we were more compassionate. And I,
Yeah,
it comes down to the C word,
yeah,
to me. And so looking at I think most of community sort of, again, second point of being reductive. So I'm going pretty well. Is that people think it's a choice. They think that these kids, more specifically, my cohort that I work with, males, these kids that come from an environment drenched in complex trauma,
mm,
to sort of be dismissive of the neurobiology that's involved in going through with that, and to say that then that crime is a choice, I think is devoid of two things. Well, I think it has two elements. I think number one, it's ignorant. And I think number two, it's not very compassionate. So my invitation is to start discussions, like this on your wonderful podcast here, and to say, look, can we start to use critical insight, critical reflection to really look at what's underneath the thin veneer, and just safely and compassionately start to have some of these discussions.
yeah.
So,
What age are we talking about? Under 18s, right?
well, don't forget, Joey, we're in a country where we're one of the few countries of the world where we can charge children of 11 years old with adult crimes.
Right. So
Now,
the kids the men that you're working with are all young, and
oh
so
yeah,
and what you were saying before about the media, like I live in Point Cook, for example, and we've been having lately, or not more now, but like before COVID, we were having those Sudanese boys
yes, South
raiding, right?
Sudanese.
Yeah, and so that was at the shopping centre just up the road. But you see that on the news, and I understand, I have compassion, but I also understand how that media coverage would have frightened people, and so then they just automatically think that if you really think about all the Sudanese incidences, which is random, but then everyone starts assuming that everyone's like that, so it causes this lack of compassion because people want to feel safe. Do you think
Yeah,
that's a main factor of the public's misconception, that they're just either coming from fear or they're basing it on non-truths?
both. I mean,
Yeah.
let's be honest that most of the messaging that we receive from media is, it's about sort of, I think in the sales term, you're trying to the tricky oily sales term is leverage behavior. And so that's another way of saying that we will kind of broadcast fear-based messages, or a lot of it is about, you're not going to be okay, or you won't be accepted unless you buy or interact with these products. So the South Sudanese, I mean, you know, guess what? The overwhelming, um, I suppose, race. And let's remember that race is a term that was created. But let's say the overwhelming race that is in incarceration facilities is, guess what?
Sudanese?
White,
Oh, okay.
white. No,
Right.
no one wants to talk about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I don't think we talk about it at all. Like, really, I mean, like, I'm just trying to reflect on what you were saying about the media. I don't really know of many times that they show us like kids getting arrested and all that. I think it's something that's hidden. So there's this sort of like out of mind, out of sight sort of thing. Like, what is it really like in there then? Can you give us like a quick overview of what, you're saying that it's mainly white, but what is life in custody for the youth like?
Well, when I say mainly white, I say the overall population, but relative to demographics and numbers of cultural populations, we need to be clear that our Indigenous community and our so Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders and our island populations are massively overpopulated relative to the number in their demographic. But just to come back to that point, Joey, what I meant was saying, but if you believe the media stories, then they should be going, oh my God, there's a problem with white people in this country.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing is that I just want to piggyback onto that is that, you know, you and I are of a similar vintage. The South Sudanese are just the enemy du jour at the moment. You would remember a time when it
Mm.
was the Lebanese,
The
you know,
Vietnamese.
the Vietnamese,
It was me,
exactly.
it was me once. It was
Yeah.
the Italian Maltese. I mean, I
Hey,
remember.
bro, my mum's Italian. You know, I remember that. I remember that word. Yeah. So in terms of, sorry, I've segued myself, but what is it like in there? Oh man, um,
Is it like a
there,
real prison or is it a bit easier?
there are sections. So you have a kind of like a higher, I guess a higher security section that, yeah, that feels very much like a prison. And then you have what's more called the open site, where the kids are they're older and honestly, man, there are sections. If I took a photograph of the facility that we operate as a school from certain angles, you'd go, "Oh, that's just a school," which is obviously very much by design.
Mm.
So, my day in there is varied, but um, I love it. I honestly, Joey, I'm going to be stressing more and more fearful and more activated if you chuck me into a grey suit and ask me to get into a grey car and drive me into a grey building and ask me to look at grey bits of paper and spreadsheets and do
Yeah.
numbers. Like that's just me.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have a bad day, man.
I mean, what you're sort of saying is that you are normalizing that we're all human and not every situation is ideal. So it's about treating these young guys like humanly. Like it's they're just that's what the other interview was about. This explaining that everyone makes mistakes and there's the situations. Um, in regards,
Absolutely.
in regards, this is just me just wanting to know this question. Do you believe that there is it more hopeful, or do you believe that some of these young guys end up taking the path of criminal life?
What you're speaking to specifically would be the the metric of recidivism, and yeah, the numbers aren't great. Um, if you get caught up in that, it becomes fairly it seems like it's pretty predetermined.
Right.
And that is a shame because again, this might sound strange, but complex trauma we know is as real a thing physiologically, neurobiologically, as having a broken leg, and so I know it sounds absurd, but yeah, to sort of to see someone end up on a predetermined path because they broke their leg,
Mm.
to me, it's almost as absurd. So where it is hopeful is, and for your audience who might be interested, it's fantastic to Google places like Finland, Denmark, Norway, and now New Zealand, where they are looking at um, offenders, in general, but particularly with youth, as a rehabilitation model. So kids come in and they get therapy, they get nutritional advice, they get taught about life skills, communication, um, and the statistics when over there are quite amazing. They have vacancies,
I mean, I see. This is where I'm naive. I honestly thought that what you just described is what we do here. Like, you know what I mean? I thought that that going into prison is about rehabilitation. So, and do you feel like we've got a long way to go? Do you?
I feel like you know here we go as my caffeine is settling in. I feel like many things there's the thin veneer of what we think goes on, and then there's what's going on, and sometimes what lies beneath is a little bit malevolent.
Mm,
um so that would be, someone asked me when I was interviewed a while ago, someone asked me what the biggest challenge is that we have, and that is operating a school which is rehabilitation based and trauma responsive practice within an environment that's shifting, that is absolutely shifting towards that landscape, but because of the nature of their operational requirements is largely more punitive um, in scope. So
Mm.
I actually think some fantastic things could be done. And by the way, having said that, we've had kids graduate and move into university and completely reintegrate back into society.
Mm.
Um,
Do you end up going back to earlier? Do you in the program do you end up teaching them some of those skills that you feel that kids don't have?
ah,
You know, like
well,
the life skills of managing crisis and managing change and things like that.
well, as an organisation, we've had to construct from a strong evidence base our own pedagogy, and a big part of that has been culturally responsive practice and trauma responsive practice. So we're sort of we're moving as quick. I mean, the school's only been operating for 7 years. You know, the landscape shifts very quickly, but we've moved in a direction where we're trying to contextualize what we do as a school to the needs of the kids, right?
Mm.
So we're kind of seen as quite unique. Unique is a kind word in that, I've had teachers from other schools come out and observe what I do and completely freak out because have apologized to a student, you know? So I've had a student say, "Oh, did you do this, this, and this?" And I'll go, "Oh, I'm so sorry, man. I forgot," you know? And the teacher, I felt that person kind of stiffen. And why did you apologize to that child? Because I'm a confused old man that forgot stuff and I let him down. And I would do that to any human. Yeah.
Yeah. So they saw that as being a weakness, did they?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Some sort of, how are you supposed to hold a leadership position when
Yeah.
it's like, well,
It's sort of in a way we're still, even though we're progressing, I still feel like we're still behind. Like some of these, that to me is still a very old way of thinking.
it is. It is,
You know, and
and
we're trying to make the youth change, but yet we're not changing.
we've had kids like to try to give yourself and the listeners some perspective, or the viewers. We've had kids where we spend part of our budget on, making birthday cakes, and we've had kids. I've had quite large children, that have, a history, quite a decent history of offending, break down into tears and hug me because they've never had a birthday cake, brother. They've
Mm,
never had anyone. I mean,
wow.
brings your tears to your eyes. They've never had anyone sing them happy birthday. So
Yeah.
like there's just things that we've got to safely create a landscape to go. Listen, before you want to chuck that large rock that's probably wrapped in the Herald Sun newspaper, and may or may not be an Andrew Bolt article, but just have some consideration, dude. Like
Yeah.
these kids have had a completely different landscape.
And I should have asked you that earlier, so I'm so sorry. But if we can go back to the beginning,
Do
like
it, man.
what are the main reasons? Because I do think this is also another misconception. What do you feel are the main reasons why they do what they do? Is it because of what you're saying? They've got these upbringings that are quite traumatic, or
Absolutely.
do you feel like there's other reasons for them to go down that path?
I believe if we had to be, and I think I'm counting, this is only my third point of being reductive, but if we had to be reductive and say it's one thing, with my experience, I would say trauma and complex trauma. And, you know, Joey, with your background, you and I can just sit there and nod because we know that by the time we're talking, we're adding complex to the word trauma. It has not been a cakewalk,
Yeah, and
Um,
it impacts the subconscious and becomes part of their being. And so a lot of people don't have compassion for understanding that because they're only looking at the action rather than looking at the story.
Exactly right. And that's what we're trying to do. Again, a summary. I'm trying to see the child, not the trauma. No,
Mm.
I'm trying to listen to what they're communicating, and I'm not focusing on the tragic expression of unmet needs. So that's more to look at someone like Professor Marshall Rosenberg's work, with nonviolent communication. But it is to say that because of complex trauma, their brains are different.
Mm,
And we want to try and harness a trauma responsive practice to utilize neuroplasticity because, our brains are incredible in that regard. Um, yeah, and sort of moving in and out of a landscape of saying, safely having discussions with these kids and saying, listen, little brother, I know that you grew up seeing males communicate that way, or I know that you grew, because we have female teachers, um, and it is very challenging for them. So
mm,
trying to get, instead of sort of saying, well, you're a piece of so and so because you said that, try to pull them aside and go, listen, I know that you grew up thinking that that's normal, little cuz, but it's not. And let's sort of start to explore better ways to express yourself. So much with what I do with teaching mindfulness and mindful self-compassion is trying to help people with how they express their needs under duress.
mm. How does that then, does it play out at all with mental health issues? Like, do you,
Absolutely.
I can imagine, like, I'm just listening to you going, there must be a lot of mental health stuff going on. And, I know there's a lot of misconception with youth suicide. Like, people say, oh, no, no, there isn't. Yes, there is. Regardless of getting into that, does the mental health part become a big issue for them? Like, in trying to become, I guess, rehabilitated?
As with all rooms that we travel in, there are these giant elephants sitting in rooms for all of us, right? That are the mental health elephant,
Yeah.
So for these kids, the room is a lot smaller and the elephants are a lot bigger, and so it is always at the forefront. That these children, because of their trauma, they receive messages differently, they encode messages differently, and and that's okay. And I really want to be clear that part of the skill of working in this environment is holding space for the populations that they've negatively impacted. So I'm not sitting here like, it's not all, farting sunshine and unicorns. It's understanding that these, and giving space and holding respect for the communities that these kids have impacted
Yeah.
negatively.
So in a way,
Yeah.
you're sort of trying to make them also take responsibility for what they've done.
Otherwise, what is the point, my
Yeah,
dude?
yeah. I mean,
It's like,
I
okay,
understand what you're saying about the history, which is fantastic, because you're unraveling their life, but at the same time, you don't want to give them a free pass
no.
because some of these kids would be young, wouldn't they?
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So we have them anywhere between the age of 11, and the oldest we might have is up to about 23 because they're completing sentences that they started when they were younger.
right.
Um, but the other two ginormous elephants, like, I mean, Hannibal would go, Jesus, they're impressive elephants, is undiagnosed mental illness or misdiagnosed mental illness and drug addiction. So, you know, it's tough, man. You come into this system and you see these kids, you know, methadone and all these sorts of things. As a teacher, your day is unusual because you just got to work out what your kids are coming up and coming down from. Because of course they all trade them, as you would. You
Mm.
know, I'm not going to knock people's hobbies.
I mean, this is
Um,
why you're an amazing man to work in that industry. So, do you just, from your own heart, do you feel that, because I can tell that you care, do you
yeah,
feel the system cares? I mean, I know
I,
it's sort of like a very loaded question, but do you feel that there is an intention by the
I do.
system?
I really do. I think, that it's a bit. However, it is a bit like turning the Titanic. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
I'm always curious. Surely there was someone on on the Titanic that went, "Oh, Captain, that's an iceberg," and the captain went, "Get away from me, Ponsonby!" You know, I do think it. I do think that there is an intent, but the message has to go through so many conduits and so many channels. And dude, some of that is political. Um,
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely I mean, I feel like it's been years.
yes,
In my
yeah,
time as a therapist, it's been years. I mean, like, this is 2020, we're entering a new time. It shouldn't be taking this long.
no, no. And I mean, this is, something that my wife is working with at the moment, and something that I've encountered teaching mindfulness is that, the next wave of the pandemic is mental health,
Yeah.
after this COVIDication, brother. So, and again, there's unfortunately a lot of men doing some unskillful stuff, because when society takes away all your, all your, I mean, a kind version might be your outlets, but the others might be your distractions or your diversions.
Mm.
Um, yeah, it can be really tricky. But so we try to shift. So I try to shift my understanding. So a trauma responsive practice is utilizing unconditional positive regard, which you as a therapist would be well understanding of. But just for your crew, it's separating. I warned you that I gesture. It's separating behavior from regard. So the difference between saying when I was a kid, and I'd messed up, and my mum would go, "You're a little so and so because you did that." Whereas these days, what I will say to my children is, "I love you, absolutely love you dearly, but what you just did is not okay, and we
Mm.
need to discuss." That way, without going too deeply into it, that way I don't go into an invalidation spiral, and my field of perception stays open for reason. You know,
Mm.
so all these old skills, which to be honest with you, when I've taught some of these kids mindfulness practice, trauma informed mindfulness practice, it's been incredible. In fact, they will tell me things, or utilize teaching cues that I use with normal population
Mm.
quite
I
quite
think what happens is that we forget that they're kids.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like a kid is a kid, but if they're wearing a mask of being something else, what you're doing is removing that. Can I ask you about again? I'm asking you a lot of questions that get you to give us your opinion.
I don't mind.
How do you
That's
feel
all I got.
about the white privileged youth versus what you see every day? Like, because
Uh,
it's funny how they're still doing things like they're still doing things, but there seems to be a brush over versus like when we talk about people from the western suburbs or different areas, like what's your take on that?
yeah, look, my experience of that has been prevalent, often, and firsthand. That I'm pretty safe to say that we still live within quite a racist culture. Um, Now, whether that be, I can tell you stories of two kids doing the same offence. One of them happens to be Corey, the other one isn't,
Mm.
and one getting off and one not, because of access to finance, because of access, things like that. I mean, that happens with monotonous regularity. Yeah, so I mean, let's be honest, brother. Again, not to be too negative, but we still don't have a treaty. We still live in a country where we don't have a treaty. We're still technically this is an occupation, and it's such a beautiful community with such incredible skills and such you know such a rich history. you know it seems to me still that we are in some ways a society that's a bit cray cray, certainly a society that's not compassionate. So I'm happy to chat with anyone about that. My direct experience has been, it's a deeply racist environment, and that might even be the staff using horrible racist language. So it's a very, very tricky landscape.
Yeah, you're very honest, which I love. I could talk to you
Probably
for
probably lose my
hours.
job now.
Well, like it's again, you're very honest, but I think our listeners have an open mind and can understand what you're saying. And I could talk to you for hours, but time is ticking over. I want to ask you one more question,
Do it.
and that is that our listeners are predominantly male. What advice would you give them in regards to the interpretation that they can start implementing in regards to the youth of today, especially young men? What do older men need to do to help the younger guys?
I would say start with yourself. I would say be kind to yourself and to others. There's not a lot of ability to help others if you're still in a position of unresolved yourself. The the concept of empathy fatigue or compassion fatigue is going to burn you out pretty quickly.
Mm,
So my invitation is to look at some self-regard practices to get high on your own supply.
yeah.
Why consider that what you would say to a friend when a friend has a misfortune or makes a mistake is completely different, let's be honest, to what you'd
Mm,
say to yourself.
yeah.
So my invitation is to perhaps give some space to meditate on that. That's a whole nother discussion, Joey. A whole nother day is, why is it okay that we walk around with a rancid internal dialogue? Like,
Mm,
why has that been normalized, my brother? So
yeah. Well, it's a male thing, isn't it? About it's sort of like sometimes pigeonholed in what we think we should be doing. So,
exactly.
if we take that your advice on, how do we then transfer it onto, if we learn about ourselves, do we then just use that as a way to connect with people and then help them? Is what you mean?
The biggest thing I've learned is there's what you do and then there's what you say, and the kids learn as much, if not more, from watching.
Right.
So I have a young son, and I'm constantly trying to encourage him to be kind to himself. I've got to model that. I've got to be that because he picks up on it. And that's very much what I think with the next generation. So the good news is, guys, I think there's some important and beautiful embodied work for us to do. Um, and I think the recurring theme of this whole discussion is it's about the acquisition and the modeling of skill sets. I think so much of behavior, particularly with men, comes down to skill sets. Often as a male, you will spend more time reading an IKEA catalog than you would working out what's going on within yourself and what skills you could use to explore that,
Yeah.
you
I
know?
mean, I also just want to add to that. I think that there needs to be an acceptance with vulnerability because vulnerability seems to be a taboo word for men. I mean, in the secret men's business, that's one of the main things that we try and encourage is for men to be vulnerable. And there's nothing wrong with showing your emotion rather than being uncomfortable to be emotional.
Absolutely, man. 100%. I think vulnerability cannot in this age going forward be a dirty word.
Yeah.
It's got to be just part of the Rubik's cube that is us.
Yeah. Mike, I could talk to you. I think I'm going to have you back on because
Oh, dude, I'll come back on anytime. I love your show. I love your vibe, brother.
thank you so much for coming on our show today. And thank you for being a legendary catalyst for change within men. So I really appreciate all your work.
Oh, dude, same back at you. These are important discussions, and good on you for creating a safe landscape to start to mine a bit more deeply, brother.
Thank you. That was Mike Pringle, and thank you for listening to the Secret Men's Business podcast. Now, be mindful that we have 2 episodes a week now, so look out for the Mondays and Thursdays, either on your listening channels or platforms or YouTube on SMB TV. So, thanks everyone. Have a great week, and we'll catch up with you soon. Bye.